Hello, everyone. Have you ever had a job before? What was your experience like? Think about jobs the adults around you have. What do you think a typical day looks like for them? Now that you've done that, I want to introduce you to my good friend Timmy. Timmy is a 10-year-old boy who lives in England during the Industrial Revolution. Instead of going to school and playing at recess with his friends, he works in a factory making textiles for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. He is sometimes punished for taking breaks or falling asleep even though he is made to work late into the night. One of his jobs is to climb into the big factory machines and clean them. It's a dangerous job because the machines are heavy and can sometimes crush people inside them. 3 of Timmy's friends have been severely injured doing this job. His family needs him to work, though, to be able to afford the small basement apartment they share with another family in London. It's not the best time or place to be a 10-year-old, but groups of people called labor unions have been forming and promising a better future for Timmy. How was a typical day at the modern-day job you were picturing similar to a day in Timmy's life in the factory? How was it different? Today, we're going to discover the reforms and changes that came from labor unions in the Industrial Revolution. To do so, we're going to answer the following questions. What are labor unions, and what are their benefits and drawbacks? What laws and changes emerged from labor unions and the Industrial Revolution? Why did other movements grow out of labor reform? What impact did the movements have on society? Here's a big picture question for you to think about throughout the entirety of this lesson. How do the labor and reform movements from the Industrial Revolution impact labor and living standards today? Previously, we learned that while the Industrial Revolution led to progress in production and technology, the movement created a lot of negative societal consequences. Today, we'll examine how these unintended side effects helped spur the creation of labor unions and government reforms across the world. A labor union is an organization that speaks for all laborers in a particular trade, like painters, for example, that advocates for higher wages and better working conditions. The main goals of labor unions during the Industrial Revolution were to increase pay for workers, limit working hours, and increase regulations to create safer working conditions. Labor unions primarily engaged in negotiations with companies, and when negotiations failed, they turned to strikes in order to achieve their goals. Strikes are more than a bad swing in baseball. They are also an organized event where all workers in a particular industry or company refuse to go to work until the company or industry implements change. The first unions were created among skilled workers, people like carpenters, printers, and spinners. Their special skills helped to ensure that they were not easily replaceable by employers, so they had more bargaining power. These unions ended up helping the lower middle class more than the actual poor in urban society. When unions began forming in England, the government saw them as a threat to the established social order, so they tried to halt union growth quickly by imposing harsh laws. However, their anti-labor laws were largely ignored by workers and were eventually repealed. Over in the U.S., several smaller unions joined to become the American Federation of Labor in 1886 to gain more influence. Like in England, unions all over the industrialized world received large amounts of pushback from governments and companies for several different reasons. 1. Labor unions had gained a reputation for violent strikes and the beating of scabs or people who filled the positions of striking workers. 2. Higher wages and better working conditions were costly for a company. This would mean smaller returns for company bosses and the possibility of shutting down. The main argument was that having any job, even with bad working conditions, was better than having no job at all. 3. Governments did not approve of labor unions because they believed that labor unions largely hurt the economy by causing delays in production. Let's pause the video here. What are labor unions and what are their benefits and drawbacks? After continued pressure from unions such as the AFL, governments slowly but surely began introducing labor laws to help protect all workers. A few accomplishments of unions in Britain in the 1800s include making child labor illegal, limiting the hours children, teens, and women could work per day, and making it illegal for children and women to work underground in mines. One of the first important laws enacted to protect laborers was the Factory Act of 1833. The law made it illegal to hire children in England under 9 years old and put restrictions on the hours of other youth. In the United States, it took until the early 1900s for much progress in terms of labor laws. Eventually, the U.S. began by banning child labor under the age of 14 and continued to limit working hours of teens, women, and eventually men. All this may not seem like a lot when you think about the typical workday today, but it is a huge improvement from the daily life of Timmy that we looked at the beginning of this video. Remember, sometimes big historical changes have to happen slowly. Go ahead and pause the video here once again to reflect on the following questions. What laws and changes emerged from labor unions and the Industrial Revolution? Let's think back to Timmy and his family. List as many ways as you can the labor laws we just discussed could benefit Timmy's family. Labor laws like the Factory Act created the time and space for groups of people to push for more rights in other aspects of life. There are three main reasons why labor reforms led to larger societal movements. 1. Changing society led to new opportunities. The breakdown of traditional agrarian societies caused marginalized groups to advocate for their rights. 2. Increased quality of life meant more free time. Labor laws improved daily life and provided more freedom for people to participate in other movements. And 3. Groups left out of mainstream change came together. Labor laws and unions largely benefited the majority white lower middle class and often led to underprivileged groups being left out. To have their voices heard, these groups banded together to form their own specific movements. The three movements we'll be focusing on are abolitionism, women's rights, and education reform. Abolitionism is the movement to end the institution of slavery. As workers in industrialized nations began to gain more rights and machines were quickly replacing manual labor, the push to end slavery was greatly strengthened, as slavery was the exact opposite of what labor unions were pushing for. An institution that regularly dehumanized people and refused to compensate them for their labor stood in stark contrast to unions demanding safer working conditions and higher pay. Many countries began systematically banning slavery, including Britain in 1833, the U.S. in 1865, and finally Brazil in 1888. The women's rights movement was a push from activists to gain job freedom, higher wages, and the right to vote. During the Industrial Revolution, several industries became largely female-dominated, like textile factories. Women quickly began to organize into labor unions in these jobs, and by the mid-1800s, women's rights movements had taken hold in both the United States and Great Britain. Education reform was the movement to create a free education system that all students could benefit from. Before industrialization, there was no formal free schooling system in place for children. Before you get too excited dreaming about not having to sit in school all day, just remember our friend Timmy and his long and scary days working in the factory. It makes math class seem much less terrifying. In the U.S., several states had created public school systems by the 1850s, and free public school became an option in Western Europe in the late 1800s. Pause the video here and record your answer to the following question in your PDF. Why did other movements grow out of labor reform? What impact did they have on society? We've covered a lot of information on major changes and reforms that came from the Industrial Revolution. We looked at the formation of labor unions and how they prompted change and explored the larger social movements that stemmed from this rapidly changing society. Today, labor unions are widespread and a common occurrence in many industries all over the world. Social movements that stem from increased freedom and better working conditions continue to make progress and benefit society every day. Can you think of any labor or social movements that you've heard of this year? As you know, historians, events from the past leave their mark on the present and future. Keep searching for these connections because history is everywhere.
Hey, hey.